Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you back. I think we're live now. Is that correct? Okay. I want to welcome everybody now to this final session of our seminar on what humans can learn from animals. And this is going to be a panel discussion with our three speakers. You've met Professor Sharon Holland, Professor Al Duncan, and Professor Karen Finnig in the last three sessions of the seminar. Before we begin, I just want to remind you of some upcoming events. This next Wednesday, March the 31st, we are having a special edition of Lunch with Friends and Strangers featuring Heidi Kim from the UNC Department of English. She's going to be discussing Jade Snow Wong, who is a Chinese-American artist, ceramic artist, and it will be one of our conversations in which Max will lead a discussion of an interesting and important person. And then on April the 16th and 17th, we have the annual Adams Symposium, this year featuring Professor Elizabeth Anderson, a philosopher from the University of Michigan, who is going to be talking about what the work ethic should mean in a 21st century capitalist society. That will be the keynote event on April the 16th, and then the next day, April the 17th, we'll have a panel discussion with some of our colleagues responding to her themes. And then I want to mention finally a weekend seminar with Matt Andrews, professor of history, talking about the history of the Olympics. And that's going to take place on April the 29th and the 30th. So lots of good events coming up. And the humanities are always evolving, but we never, ever disappear. It takes a lot more than a pandemic to discourage the humanists. And as I mentioned last time, the hybridity of the humanities, which always includes the sciences. Thank you, Karen. So I want to welcome everybody back. We're going to just now continue the discussion, and I want to begin with a general question while we also invite others to submit questions through the Q&A function, and I will be monitoring those questions. But I want to begin with a general question to each of you. And then if you would like to respond, or if you want to respond on anything the others have said, that would be fine too. But I want to begin with the question, what do you think is the most important lesson that people have learned from animals or drawn from animals as they try to understand human beings and human societies? What do you think has been most important in terms of the learning process in the human relationship with animals? If you look at the people you've studied or the issues you've studied, what have people most learned from animals? I know that's a big question. I don't have any particular order to go in. Maybe we should start with antiquity and then come to the modern period and then go to the sciences. Al, could you launch us with a comment on that?
I can, and I'm going to be a bit controversial here, Lloyd, and I'm going to say, in a way, from antiquity, they learned nothing from animals. And what I mean by that is going back to my presentation and going up to some of the things that Professors Holland and Fennig have had to say. There's a real way that we are obstinate in our anthropocentrism, that we tend to see animals as we see ourselves, and that there's this amazing natural world for us to be learning from out there, and yet we can't seem to escape this cycle of finding ourselves in nature, for looking for what makes humans human in the natural world. I mean, I think we could adduce countless examples, right? That heteronormativity is in the natural world and therefore it must be the way. Well, it turns out that once you start uncovering, that's not necessarily the way that all species work throughout time. The competition, the selfish gene, as Dr. Fennick was just saying, is a case in point. I think it's been very, the thing I've taken away that's been most disappointing or depressing about this event, and I'll come back with why I think it's positive in the end, is just that we have been so selfish, maybe is the word for it, in seeing ourselves in the outside world. That said, I think nature provides this wonderful counterexample to human life. And this is something we certainly see in the Greeks and the Romans, of seeing the
Mhm.
natural world as fundamentally distinct from the human world. It's a check on our power. It's a check on our hubris. We think we control, we think we know, and yet something comes back to haunt us in the end. I think of Make Me Do, Pistatyrus in Birds, going out thinking that he can outsmart the birds, have this utopian world that will serve him, but he can't escape it in the end. So I think that nature is going to be there to catch us when we fall.
Mhm.
And I can't ask for a better pillow or blanket or safety net than that.
So you think maybe it teaches us a certain humility if we pay attention to what,
Yeah, we might be late to learn it, but I think it will outlast us.
so I want to ask Sharon what you might think about what have people learned from animals, or drawn from their experience and encounter with animals?
Oh, wow. I mean, that's such a great question, right? But I have a very simple answer for it, and that's joy. How to have
Oh,
joy.
and
I
why?
I've, animals are not here for our entertainment. I understand that. But one of the things they do remind us of, while foraging, while playing together, while going about our business, on a farm or in a barn or just on a dog walk, right? Um, the capacity to find something new every day and the capacity for joy in that discovery. And I've seen horses, play with balls. I've seen a horse who was bored pick up a cone and throw it at the back of a bunch of humans who were like just not paying attention. And making I've bent over in front of a stall with a hoodie on and had a horse pull the hoodie back and have me freak out so that I wind up on the ground. The capacity for joy and the capacity, I think, for intense, like, forgiveness.
Yeah,
um yeah, so anyway, it's a simple answer. It's not, it's actually from the vantage point of animal observation, it's a pretty scientific observation that there's lots of play.
yeah. That is a great point. I think this is something people have learned during the pandemic too, when we haven't been with other people as much. The consolation of being with animals has been incredibly important. And I can't tell you how many people I've heard who said, I got a puppy or I got a cat or I spend more time, with my animals. So I think there's both a joy and a mystery about animals, right? There's like, what's going on in their minds and what's happening there. Karen, what do you think is most important about what people have learned from animals or from animals as they think about their own societies and so forth?
Well, I mean, from the science perspective and, thinking about evolution, it was obviously revolutionary to think in terms of our relationships, that we are, how interrelated we are with animals, and how similar we are. One of the surprises is that we share many of the exact same genes. That's why we can do experiments on fruit flies and get insight into human disease, right?
Mhm.
And so, but I guess I would also reiterate the ideas of humility and joy. And for me, as somebody who studies behavior, I think the humility is particularly important because I think we don't understand entirely what this notion that we project onto animals what we are thinking without
Mhm.
really understanding that we don't actually know. And, I hear people, I have fun talking to some friends of mine who talk about, what if we encounter extraterrestrials, and, we have this conversation about, well, will we even be able to communicate with them? It's like, well, we can't even communicate with most of the creatures on our planet. We
Mhm.
are amongst, aliens. What makes us think why would we go looking for some other extraterrestrials when we have an entire world to explore these other minds that have insights and ways of thinking that we have no idea. And
Yeah,
that to me
yeah.
is what we don't know is part of, I think, what is exciting to know, is starting to understand what we don't know. So I don't
I
know if that
love
makes
that.
sense.
I think, in other words, it's an encounter with otherness. We often talk about the encounter with difference or otherness. So each of these answers, humility, joy, and the encounter with otherness, really shows, I think, the enriching presence of animals. And each of you have talked about that in different ways. I'm going to come, we actually have a question already here from our colleague Max, who was with us last night, and he is following up. It actually builds on this question of what can we learn from animals. He says, we've encountered the issue of anthropocentrism and how we view the animal world. Can you speak to the idea of intelligence in animals? It seems that we're often impressed by human-like actions, but don't appreciate that animals have different intelligences and experiences, and they experience the world differently. This is kind of the point you were just making, Karen. Could you each address the idea of the intelligent animal and how it might be either limiting or helpful in understanding the natural world and our relationship with it? What does it mean to think about intelligent animals? Anybody want to jump in on that?
I can start, I
Yeah,
guess.
go ahead, Sharon.
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the things I look at in my work are the ways in which we think about animal life as separate. And, I think that Dr. Penning is right about that we think about that life as separate from our own is so very different as an other, right? As opposed to part of the same, right? And so I think we have these capacities, language, intelligence, sentience, all of these ways in which we try to understand, the animal by othering it already, right? And, when I think about the intelligence of animals and I think of human being as animals, I think about, the climate change crisis we're in right now and what's going on with, our extinction events and the microbiome and everything. And I think, for an intelligent species, we certainly get that wrong, right? That all of a sudden there's so many people, the proliferation of books now where people are engaging the natural world as if all of a sudden it hasn't been there, right? Because at the moment that we're losing this world, it seems to be captivating us. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that what if we tried to approach the animal, right? Agamben, a philosopher, says something really beautiful in a book called The Open. He says, what if we let the animal come to us? And a profound question about our motives, right? What if we let the animal be, right? What if we let the animal come to us? And I think about that. I think about that in terms of being a human being. What would it be like to see somebody and not take everything we see at face value? What if we let other human beings come to us and tell us who they are? We wouldn't make pronoun mistakes. We wouldn't make a lot of the mistakes. I have my students in the animal studies class go for a weekend, with not assuming just because they see someone and they read who that person is, not assuming that that's who they're going to be when they actually get in conversation, but to let that person come to them fully. And that is something that I've learned from working with horses in particular, and also from just watching dogs and the way they interact with one another.
So the question of animal intelligence might be simply also an encounter of again, encountering the other and letting the other be fully other, not trying to assimilate them entirely into our categories. And that's a skill then that affects our relation with human beings as well. What do you think, Al, about Max's question about what do we do about the question of the intelligence of animals?
Yeah, I was thinking about this for a while because obviously for Aesop, there's a pecking order where we put the fox at the level that's closest to humans. And in ancient Greek thought, humans really did stand out. I mean, we can thank, blame probably is a better word, the Greeks for making some of this logocentrism that's attached to humans, that it's the rational account that
Mhm.
Aristotle so prizes that becomes part of what defines us as human. And we have a direct path between that moment and then a Linnaean Homo sapiens, that where man the wise, as opposed to man the maker, man the player, these other kind of ideas that have been around. I wanted to come back to monsters on this because I gave them a bad rap or a bad name. Monsters, these hybrid figures in Greek myth, often are dispensers of profound wisdom.
Oh,
So
uh-huh.
you have a centaur. Many centaurs are bad. They're bestial. They're the type of creatures that we don't want humans to be, and they fight humans and lose because of their nature. But there's also one Chiron, who is the teacher of heroes. Achilles learns from him. Jason learns from him. He is a master of multiple domains. He's able to understand the world in different ways. Another one is Silenus. He's the kind of proto-satyr figure. And he has this deep wisdom that was very inscrutable to a lot of the ancients. But his main point was, it's better to not be born, and if you are born, to live as quickly as possible. And that's the Silenus. It's enigmatic, it's obscure, but it's a gesture toward this kind of wisdom that is against or deeper or antecedent to the human wisdom that we put forward. So there's always that tension there, and monsters really, perhaps because of their hybridity, have this perspective, this broader perspective that does shine a light on the narrowness of human knowledge.
Hmm. So hybridity actually is also seen to be wise or productive in some way in some of these stories.
Exactly.
Yeah. What do you think about the intelligence of animals and of any kind of animal? Karen?
Um, well, well, first of all, I want to say now I'm even happier to be a hybrid. um, but so I guess one of the interesting things as somebody who studies behavior is, and I guess this is where I'm always reluctant to think about animals as other, or that yes, there is a, a way in which their intelligence, we have to think in terms of the intelligence that is good for them, right? So octopuses are incredibly intelligent and they're really good at being octopuses. A sparrow is really intelligent at being sparrows. At the same time, I think we are interrelated. We are descended from common ancestors. So there's no reason to expect that their intelligence is necessarily radically different from our own.
Mhm.
And there's a really nice book by Frans de Waal called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? Something like that. And basically, and this goes to what Sharon was saying, that we have to let animals tell us how they're intelligent they are, because we cannot design
Mhm.
experiments that are for opposable thumbs for a particular kind of primate, and that when we actually set up things that are designed for their bodies, for their way in which they move through their world, we actually discover much higher cognitive function and much deeper ranges of emotions than we might recognize, right?
Mhm.
And so the notions that dogs have moral senses, a sense of what's right and wrong and what's fair, or the ability of rats to rescue one another and share food, we get that sense of self-sacrifice, altruism,
Mhm.
the capacity for grief, by being able to actually see animals either in their natural state or providing them with opportunities to show us who they are in the context of what they are physically capable of doing and expressing. And
Mhm.
to degree our understanding of intelligence is, I think, really limited, is that we just haven't either had the tools or the curiosity to allow animals to tell us, right? I mean,
Mhm.
how much time or money goes into research on, translating and decoding whale song, right? Or, you know, complex language of dolphins. They're speaking. We just don't, you know, it's as if, you know, we go to another country with a language we've never understood and no relationship to any sort of syntax or grammar we've ever seen. And so we assume that those people must be stupid. And that's not what we would do, right? And so, but that's essentially what we are doing. So I think that's an important component as well.
Yeah, I think that the mystery of animals and taking them seriously is something that people appreciate much more. As Al said, that sort of Aristotelian tradition of radical separation has broken down a little bit, in that we're recognizing it's different. It's very different, but it's not radically different in the ways that we might have assumed, including emotions. I have a question here from Julia Barton. Do any of the panelists know how ancient Middle Eastern or Asian cultures viewed animals versus the Western or European or American view, I guess we could say? Is there a different view of animals in these other cultures in Asia or the Middle East? Do you know?
I can start by saying I don't know, and that's a problem. I think that speaks a lot to classics as a discipline and the narrow silos that we've found. I think looking for early interactions, I think there's a bit of a convergent evolution once we start getting into larger cities and other things. Comparative folktale is going to give you a lot of insight into this. And then real historical traditions. I'm coming from a narrow one that's been privileged historically. That's why we have a department. It'd be a fascinating thing, and it might help unseat some of the problematic assumptions that have fed into our current world.
Mm-hmm. What about that? Do either of the other of you, Sharon or Karen, have any notion of how these how other cultures may have viewed animals differently?
I don't necessarily, you know, look at the ancient world, but in terms of one of the things I found doing my research, and I think this comes out of Edward Hotling's work, but I could be wrong about that, is that, you know, the Malenke people on the continent of Africa were brought here to work with horses. And there's a wonderful, I forget the name of the book right now. I think it's because it's late on a Friday. But there's a wonderful book that treats the relationship between kind of the British thoroughbred, right, and the kind of Arabian kind of horse, and the different ways in which the British related to horses and the way, you know, Arabs related to horses. And one of the fundamental difference was that the British way of breaking a horse was very brutal, was very much tactile, lots of devices, and they were astounded by their Arab descendant counterparts who worked with horses without touching them. And they found this, just how can you do that? And what's interesting about that to me is that the way in which people approach equine therapy and work with horses has a lot of technique that doesn't really involve touching the horses, but involves moving with them. So I don't know much about the ancient world, but I do know that those forms of being with animals have definitely, you know, one of the things that people are trying to correct in looking at the slaveocracy is to think that the people of African descent who were brought here to be enslaved brought skill sets with them.
Yeah.
And so, you know, thinking about the irrigation for the rice fields, you know, in a place like South Carolina, for example. So in that regard, it's not the ancient world, but there are very different ways of dealing with animals in kind of that, you know, those early moments, you know, 15th, 16th, 17th century.
I just saw a new book came out by someone named Kari Weil about horses culture in 19th century France, and how horses were so central to every part of daily life. And this is something that people have lost sight of, you know, just the centrality of that horse-human relationship in previous centuries. So I think it's like opening up new historical, if I may speak as the historian here, it's opening up a new historical framework as well. What about that, Karen? Do you have any sense of how other cultures in either the ancient world or the more recent past have viewed animals differently?
No, I'm afraid I don't. And I think, I think this goes back to Al's comment. I think that's unfortunate. And, in science, we have a tendency to think that that kind of culture or history doesn't really matter. It's just the data. But of course, our ways of interpreting those data, our way of asking questions and how we formulate hypotheses is very much dependent upon our perspectives, right? And
Mhm.
the social background that we come to. And much of how fields like animal behavior that I'm a part of, or evolutionary biology, is grounded much more in Western culture, and is derived from that history in ways that I don't think we fully understand the impacts of that on the
Mhm.
way we've asked questions and the way we shaped
Mhm.
and framed the way the natural world works. And I think that's to our detriment in doing that.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask something about politics because, in fact, Sharon Holland's talk yesterday about move and the view of animals that was so central to that political moment. And Al mentioned animals as part of the way of doing political critiques in ancient Greece. And I've studied quite a bit of early European thought, and people like Machiavelli often used animals. He has that famous passage where he says that a ruler needs to be both a fox and a lion because a fox knows how to defend himself against snares, but a lion knows how to be strong, or the role of animals as a metaphor in politics. Could you say a little more about how animals and views of animals have affected views of political life and political or social power? Anyone want to jump in on that?
I could go as the first in chronological order, and I was talking with my wife Lauren Jarvis about this, and the emergence of the donkey and the elephant for modern politics.
Yeah, there is a good example too.
And thinking how those are strange because we don't necessarily associate the qualities that we would give to a recalcitrant donkey or a slow and wise, elephant to the respective parties. But of course, it works well for political cartoonists. When
Yes.
you can have this image, when you can have the caricature, and to put people under these banners, and I mean, of course, banners and heraldry often would use animal symbols as well. There's a way that it gets out of certain human hierarchies, but allows us to identify ourselves with certain traits, certain qualities, certain genealogies too. I think there's a real, if not racial or genetic, at least kind of ethnic component about some of these animals that we will
Mhm.
parade ourselves under their banners. So there's a strong association. Going back to the Greeks, Achilles is from, well, his soldiers are myrmidons, which means ants. And there's a strong, in Thoreau's writings from Walden, he sees this ant battle that's taking place outside of his cabin and starts casting them in his mind as, these Homeric battles that are happening between. There's a real pull for this sort of identification. I think it's
Yeah.
ultimately often very superficial, but that's in itself telling that we want to have these icons that we could rally behind, and we feel that sort of superficial association. We like doing that as humans.
Yeah, and like you say, national identities often do that too, like the eagle for the United States, or the cock for France, or there are many symbols like that. Sharon, you talked more about this in relation to the 1970s, 1980s, but how do you think attitudes about animals are still part of the political culture we're in right now?
Most definitely. I think those attitudes about animals are changing, very rapidly. And one of the arguments I try to make in the book, and, I tried to approach it in my talk, is that, if we go back to the 70s, there were a number of Black figures African descended folks who were very much interested in animal life and the taking of animal life, and considering, life as a single referent. And what I think that is interesting, there's someone who's coming out, I don't know their name, but I've heard that someone's coming out with a book on Move, looking at their religious philosophy. So I won't really try to think through that node. But when I think about Move's idea that life is a single referent, right? They're not thinking of themselves as pro-life, right? They're not putting a modifier on life. They're just really trying to get us to think about its meaning across a spectrum of beings. And I find that as, I find it before its time. I find it something that people are doing right now. We don't even think that every time we move a rock, every time, we walk in the woods, we are in someone else's habitat. And, certain hierarchical methodologies have allowed us to understand, ourselves as a top predator. When I think about human being, I think, if you watch lions in action, now there goes a top predator, sleep for 23 hours, stretch, yawn, 1 hour, 1 hour, and you're going to get got. Whereas, I think human beings, we're not really top predators. Technology and weapons make us so, but you can tell how insecure we are, right? Because when we go to a place, we got to take all the meat, because we're afraid there might not be any less. And I keep thinking of myself sometimes, I want to be that lion that just looks at the human being going by in the vehicle and says, it's my 12th hour. But in 10 more, you better get gone. I'm going to find you, So anyway, I think that this philosophy around thinking about, should we have slaughterhouses? What is our involvement in the killing of animals? This is going on in Black thought in the 70s. And it's significant because it has a lot to do with the condition of Blackness at that time, right? So anyway.
That's very interesting. Also, I know people like Dick Gregory, who you mentioned, were already very much in tune with these issues. And this gets back to the cultural difference issue we were talking about, like in Hindu culture or Buddhist culture, there may be much more sensitivity to that continuum of life than what we were talking about in Europe or in North America, United States, European Americans particularly. Karen, what do you think about the political elements of the view of animals or the use of animals?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, just following up on what Sharon was saying, I think that, especially as somebody who is concerned about biodiversity loss and, the current crisis that we're facing, this hierarchical notion, this notion of dominion, or being the top species, the better species, which is not, ironically, again, evolution, Darwin provided us with tree thinking, took us off the top of the ladder and put us embedded in, the evolutionary tree. But we haven't taken that to heart. And as a result, the trying to, justify the conservation or protection of biodiversity has to be done in the context of how it's good for humans, or how do we commoditize nature in ways that, setting this aside ultimately has a higher profit than, turning it into an apartment complex or whatever. And so I think that that's part of the how we have to wrestle with how we engage with politicians, the public, of, there's always a higher bidder for a natural area. There's, a species that goes extinct. So what, relative to the economic value that arises? And I don't know how we change that. I think that's what the value of these kinds of conversations and the reason why the sciences need the humanities of being able to put forward a rationale for why life should be valued just because it's life, that there shouldn't be a reason that we have to explain why an animal has any more or less value than I have. in terms of, yeah. So I just reiterate some of what's already been said.
So, that's a really interesting point. I'm thinking about the humanities as a category of knowledge also. If the humanities can be expanded in a way to take seriously animals in the same way they take human beings as serious partners in the quest for an enriched life, and the humanities could be another important frontier. Maybe the sciences are even ahead of the humanities in some ways in recognizing the meaning of that biodiversity that you've talked about. That the sciences have become less human-centric, we might say, than some other aspects of politics and culture. I'm not knocking the humanities. I'm just saying there's a lot of room for growth there, because the way people look at animals may tell you a lot about how they look at human beings as well. We have a comment from Jerry Everhard, who's asked about the role of animal sacrifice over history. And I guess this also has to do with the slaughter of animals. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, I think, with relation to animal sacrifice and the rituals around that. Does anyone have some thoughts you could offer on what is the role of animal sacrifice or the killing of animals in human societies?
I might start in again just as the chronologically prior thing, and this should be my wheelhouse, but I really do need to defer to our colleague Fred Naden for these things because he's written books on this. Something that did come up yesterday's discussion is this wonderful moment in a Greek tragedy I care much about, the Agamemnon or the Iphigenia at Aulis, where the daughter of the Greek king Agamemnon, Iphigenia, is going to be made into a sacrifice. This is to allow the winds to blow to carry the Greek ships to Troy to conduct this war. Depending on different versions of the story, at the very last moment, as the sword is coming down on her neck, the goddess Artemis replaces her with a deer, one of the animals most sacred to Artemis as the kind of mistress of the woods. And again, we get to this animal fungibility. Obviously, it's an Abrahamic sort of story here that we have, and we can find other cultural parallels. It's not exclusively Greek. But again, sometimes myth is very aware of the interchangeability of human and animal life in ways that the culture as a whole seems comfortable looking over, effacing some of these similarities and looking for difference. I'm interested when we get to some of the ways that we try to learn from animals, when we are really putting them in an objective position. I was really struck by Karen's presentation, with the grids that were placed for those, not animal life here, but plant life, these silos, these squares, this real systematized way that we try to control these animals to understand them. I worry that we need to take what Sharon was saying from Agamben, letting the animal come to us.
Yes.
I think not so extreme as true animal sacrifice, but we ask animals to sacrifice, small sacrifice, on our behalf constantly. So much so that we're really quite inured to it. This is what animal liberation might be about. I like to think of the continuity between sacrifice in that strongest sense, the religious sense, the bloody sense, but then also these micro sacrifices that add up to maybe have a similar cumulative effect.
Yeah, including slaughterhouses, which are another form of animals being sacrificed for us. Do you have any thoughts about sacrifice of animals or the rituals of animals, Sharon?
Not really. I mean, I try in my book, I talk obviously about the abattoir, I talk about slaughterhouses, definitely, and the scenes, in the scenes from Burnett's work. But, I had thought about something while Dr. Duncan was talking, but now I don't remember what it was, because I was like, oh, this could be interesting. I think when we go, but I think we've said something here that's really, really profound. And that is when we look for our object, is that object being informed by a global vision? Or is that object being informed by a very narrow vision of relation, right?
Mhm.
And so I feel that at the end of his life, when Derrida was giving those lectures about the animal, right? And he realizes in the animal that therefore I'm following. He realizes at the end that all of the texts that he's really been looking at are inadequate to the task of
Mhm.
really trying to figure out what's going on with that distinction. And
Mhm.
I think it's a profound moment, because I keep saying, well, what if he was looking at Cherokee stories? What if he were looking at Navajo, Dene people creation myths, right?
Mhm.
Where animal bodies morph into human bodies, birth animal bodies, that we're all one, right?
Mhm.
So I was thinking about that, and I I believe that we understand slaughter as sacrifice, and how we do that is we call it humane,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? We use an oxymoron, right? There's no such thing as humane slaughter. I mean, I think if you serve that up as an option for people's evenings, they would be like, no, thank you.
Mhm.
You know, no, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not really gonna know. That's not a menu I'm interested in. And so, but I feel like the very language we use in, create, points toward the problem. That if there
Mhm.
is no such thing as humane slaughter, then we need to really consider what slaughter is. And the humane part moves it towards sacrifice, like this animal is giving its life over for us. But if you've
Mhm.
been a CAFO, that's not true.
Yeah,
None of
because
that.
the animal didn't choose that particular sacrifice.
I mean, it's happening, what, at 32,000 pigs are slaughtered a day in North Carolina?
Mhm.
People standing outside the slaughterhouse giving pigs water, because they
Mhm.
dehydrate them over the 3 days before they actually put them to death.
Mhm.
And so one of the things I think that human being needs to do is we need to incline our head toward that,
Mhm.
sit in the uncomfortable moment and ask why, right? You'll see, the videos are on YouTube, they're very disturbing. But people have these water bottles, and the pigs are like, oh, thank God someone's like giving us some water, because it's just heartbreaking,
Mhm.
and it's completely unnecessary.
Mhm.
And so, but this idea that when we see meat in cellophane in the grocery store, it's so far removed from that
That's
process.
right.
Then
Yeah.
we think of that process as sacrifice.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Or if it was, they tell us the different levels of which an animal was, put to death. Here's level 1, where they got to get some fresh air, and, we're grass fed. And
Yeah,
here's level 2. We put it down to our level.
range fed rather than, yeah.
And I'm saying this as someone who's not a vegan, as someone who is an omnivore, I mean,
Mhm.
I'm saying that the purpose, I guess, was what I'm saying is not to incline someone toward one form of eating or another, but to have us think about what we do, have us stand at that ethical moment.
Our colleague Joanna Smith, who's writing her dissertation on the role of food and rituals and the slaughter of animals, the ritual slaughter of animals. She has gone to observe slaughter in the thought that she needs to understand what happens, because we are, as you say, so separated from the process.
Well, here in the South, people used to go to hog killings, there
Yeah, yeah.
in many ways, and these scenes have been replicated across, one of the most beautifully written ones is in our dear departed colleague Randall Keenan's A Visitation of Spirits.
Mm-hmm.
These were community events that
Yeah.
spoke to the life of the animal.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, whether you talk about humane slaughter, whether there's a way in which there's an industrial slaughterhouse system versus a community that's raised the animal, lived with the animal, then kills the animal. And then the animal's part of that community. That's a different thing. Karen, what are your thoughts about this issue also?
Yeah, so I mean, this is
Sacrifice or whatever.
really far afield, and I guess I'll just riff a little bit in terms of flipping it around, and again going back to this issue of biodiversity and conservation, that and I also say this as somebody who's not vegan. I don't eat mammals, but you know, our industrial meat production does have a toll on the planet, right? And that if we were to all be vegans, it's a more sustainable in terms of population, but also in terms of how it impacts, you know, forests that are be cleared for pasture and rangeland and things like that, right? And so I guess I'll flip it around and ask, what sacrifices are we willing to make if you know, we value the natural world and the diversity that's out there? Are we willing to make those kinds of sacrifices if we actually do fully understand and don't, you know, hide behind what is represented by our food there? Because you know, just amplify on what Sharon says, that it's very easy to not recognize where our food comes from. You know, for those of us not raised on a farm, you know, it's one thing for your child to want chicken nuggets until they realize what's involved in getting those to the table, right? So yeah, absolutely on that. So I guess I would ask now, at what point are we willing to make sacrifices for what we value, if we value that? Yeah.
It's an interesting question. The environmental issue is whether we think, okay, for the coming century, just as we've talked about smokestacks and automobile pollution or industrial pollution, is the question of animals going to be at the center of environmental thinking, one of the central themes of environmental thinking over the next century?
I think it has to be, and especially as we get more adept at perhaps growing, you know, so-called lab-grown meat. And do we, you know, if we can, you know, scientifically make protein, what is the need for this kind of approach to, you know, eating animals in this way?
So we have maybe the imitation of meat, like they're selling at McDonald's now or at Burger King. So you don't really eat a hamburger, but it all looks kind of like a hamburger. Maybe that's the future. I wanted to change the theme a little bit. I wanted to come back to a point that I think emerged partly in Al's talk also about stories and fables, and it's the issue of humor. It also is in literature. Why animals are often so important in communities as a way of discussing humor, making caricatures, making humorous stories, telling stories that have a point but through an animal. Any thoughts about the human use of animals for humor? Either in literature or film or storytelling?
I have some ideas, but I would love to hear from panelists or people weighing in on the chat, because I don't want to presume that I have even a tenth of the answers for these things. There's a lot of theories of humor. Some of it is what's unexpected, and I think we see how we cannot control animals. We don't know exactly what our dog is going to do, and that moment of complete surprise, that's part of the wonder of living and being among animals, I think is part of it. The sadder side, the more depressing one, it is the sense of superiority that also factors into some humor, that animals become funny when they act like men and fail to live up to the standards of men. This gets back to some of the experimentation on animal intelligence that we were hearing about from Karen. If you design a test for men to excel at, and then you give it to animals and you find that they're not living up to that standard, well, big surprise. It would be great to see people grab cardboard and try to flap their way up and stand on a electrical line. I bet the birds would find that very humorous.
Funny, yeah.
So I do think some of the things that we see from the Greeks, we do see it both ways. But unfortunately, I think the default mode is to see, oh, we can feel better about ourselves because at least we can do these human things. And it's also troubling that obviously the racist history on making caricatures about species, groups of human who we can now start associating with species. It's one thing to put it on a banner, say that the French are fighting cocks. It's another thing when you really start to treat humans as a certain type of animal,
Yeah.
because it's predicated upon these Aristotelian hierarchies. Would that we should all be flattered to be compared to animals, but of course, given the history that has been the story of our lives, those are very insidious and unfortunately very tenacious comparisons, in part because we do like to associate humans with animals.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you can reaffirm hierarchies and scapegoating with humor as well, which is often part of the story. Any other thoughts on
one, Lloyd, and then I brought it down. I promised never to do that.
You promised never to do what?
To bring something down from humor, because this is what we should be talking about, the joy of animals.
Oh, okay. Anyway, yeah, any other thoughts about humor, or you know, what animals may play, what role they may play in human uses of animals, humor?
Well, I don't think there's anyone who hasn't been outside with a squirrel working with nuts and doing something in their yard where a squirrel doesn't decide to sit on a branch and throw a nut at you. Have you noticed?
Yeah, that's
I
true.
mean, you know, and I feel like, you know, there's a tag team outside. I don't know who they are, but there's one very big one. And, you know, once a year, he gets me, you know, and I'm like, ow, you know, and then I hear that noise, you know, and I'm like, and the other one's on the other side of the yard laughing at me. Right. But I have to, in a sense, be open to that.
Yeah.
I have to actually see them, because I think it's probably happened all my life, but only recently in the last, you know, 10 years have I started being more observant.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We're all, we've all ignored a whole lot of stuff that's going on around us for a long time. Karen, do you have any thoughts about animals and humor?
Yeah,
Or
I
maybe
guess
even frogs. I don't know if frogs, there's some good
they're
frog
just,
jokes, aren't
yeah,
there?
they're just funny. But I mean, I guess, you know, just as a personal thing, you know, part of, I think, also why we relate to animals, or maybe this is just personal, is, you know, you can sometimes establish a connection with animals, you know, especially those in our homes that, that you, whether you're projecting or not, maybe it's real. I'd like to think it's real. Where it's almost like you can have an inside joke, a relationship with them in a way that, you know, you have an inside joke with a member of your family. And
Yeah.
so, you know, I have a recurring thing that goes on with my cat every night, where he sits in front of the television until I put him in a timeout. And it's, you know, our inside joke, where he runs into the bathroom and literally has to be put in a timeout, because it's his thing. And so, you know, we just have that as our relationship. He does
Yeah.
it to nobody else in the family. It's just me. And so I think part of it is also just the nature of, I like to think part of it is just the nature of the relationship that we have. And when you have nice relationships, humor is an important component of that.
You know,
So,
that is a great point, that our relations with animals include humorous games that we play, you know, and they're part of the game. You know, I have the same thing with my dog. I'll get out this little harness to take her for a walk, and she has this game where she'll run and hide under the couch and look out, and, you know, it's like, oh, now we're playing this game. So yeah, so there is, I think that's why people love animals. They make them laugh also. I was thinking of animals in stories, but animals in our daily lives bring joy, to go back to a point Sharon made before. They make us laugh. We have a question from Charlotte Bro, who says, do you think that this pandemic, during this pandemic, people have gained a better appreciation for our flora and fauna, and I would say animals as well? Have we learned something about this world around us because of our isolation and social behavior? I'm trying, this may be under the silver lining aspect. I don't know. What do you think? Does anyone have a thought on what we've learned during the pandemic about our relation to the natural world and animals?
well, one thing I'll just throw out, that a lot of scientists have been really excited by is, and I hope that the public is also seeing this, the world is a lot wilder than we think it is. It's all right at the outskirts. So as things shut down, wildlife started coming back into
Mm.
urban areas that were shut
Yeah.
down. And, everything is right there at the outskirts. And we often aren't aware of what is going on right outside our front door or our back door. And it probably would surprise us. And knowing that, and maybe having a not be I hope people are not afraid of that, but maybe have a better appreciation of what our day-to-day activities, how negatively they are impacting the natural world. And maybe there are ways that we can think about how we plan our urban areas or suburban areas that allow us to maybe coexist more readily with the natural world, rather than trying to exclude it and sanitize our living spaces of that. And I think that's, to me, one of the things that I was very excited to see. Um,
Any other thoughts about the impact of the pandemic on our relation with the natural world? One thing I think there's also been more discussion about how diseases move between animals and human beings, and where, and also if we're in their space, are we going to be more affected by what happens to animals and vice versa? That there's more of an interaction than we may have thought when we thought, oh, we've built a modern world where animals are out of the picture. It is an interesting question. The other issue about animals that strikes me is historically how they are also seen as empowering. They're seen as threatening, but also empowering. And I think this is part of the ritual of eating animals or getting the strength of animals, or even the way sports teams identify with animals. They call themselves bears or lions or tigers or, whatever it might, wolf pack. And that's supposed to suggest some kind of power. So animals aren't only seen as other, they're seen as essential for our own empowerment, I think. Well, we're coming to the end here, and I want to ask each of you for a final thought. If you were to suggest a takeaway from what we've discussed about what humans can learn from animals, what do you think it's most important for us as human beings to remember from our interactions with animals going forward, either from what we know of the natural world, the scientific world, or the cultural world? What do you most want people to understand about our relations with animals?
I'll try to use one word, just like Sharon did earlier with joy, because I thought that was brilliant. Curiosity comes out of this all from me. I want to know so much more about everything about animals after this conversation, and to realize, getting back to humility, how much more there is to know. And some of that might involve biological exploration. Some of that's going to involve me sitting out and looking out my window and seeing what's there. Better yet, on a day like today, getting out and being in nature and just being observant, letting the animal come to me. That's how I'm going to feed my curiosity. Kill the cat, won't kill me.
You let the squirrel come to you rather than you go to the squirrel.
I'll wear a hat.
What's your takeaway, Sharon?
Oh, wow, that, human being isn't the center. It's a very diverse planet out there.
Yeah.
Explore every inch and, wonder. I think, Dr. Nucken's right. Curiosity. The
Yeah.
extent to which human beings are intelligent, but sometimes not curious.
Yeah. That's a great great way to summarize. Karen, you have a takeaway word or thought?
It's difficult to come up with anything else other than, we need and should value animals in their own right. But I love the idea of curiosity and exploration. And yes, curiosity killed the cat, but the satisfaction of knowing revived it. So so no cats are sacrificed by engaging in curiosity. So for sure, I think that's the best way, and humility is the best way to approach the natural world.
I think it's a reminder of the mystery of life also. You know, mystery might be the other word. I often, you look at a dog or a cat or a horse and you think, what are they thinking? What do they know that I don't know? There's the ultimate mystery. Well, I want to thank each of you, Al Duncan, Sharon Holland, Karen Finning, for your great contributions to this conversation. I want to thank Paul Benici for all his work on the technology. He's a technological animal, if I may put it that way. He's even got a t-shirt on with a bull on it. I just want to point that out. The Durham Bulls. Anyway, thank you all. And I want to thank all of those in the audience and Max as well, Max Orr, for his leadership last night. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and spend some time in a conversation with an animal. I think we'll all learn something from that interaction. Thank you so much. And to all of you in our audience, we hope to see you again at one of our programs in the next week or two. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.